I'll just record it on my computer for now, and then I'll have the attorney review it before. So, I got a message from Max. He said he wasn't going to make it tonight. And I said, oh, don't worry about it. We're recording. You can watch it over and over and over again. It's like, yeah, right. I'll do that. So Ann, I made you co-host also. So you and Kate are co-hosts. Ann, do you want to say anything before I start?
No, I will appear when I finish eating. So
okay,
that's why
great.
I'm blacked out. And we're just grateful for you. We're going to hear what you have to tell us about yourself, so I won't jump in and try and introduce you. And by the way, we're grateful to Judy Purvis, who suggested this topic. And you, do you remember that?
And actually, it was John who suggested it to me. So.
Oh, okay. Well, John, thank you. So
you scrape the bottom of the barrel and you got me.
Right, there was no one left.
Like, oh gosh, what do we do with this? All right, cool. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you.
I don't even know where to begin to start. I have a lot of ideas in my head. I have a tendency to ramble, as those students are in here can attest to. So I'll just introduce myself quickly. I'll kind of talk about how I guess we got to this point where you all are sitting here listening to me today. And I'm going to share a couple of images too. I'm not going to share a whole lot. And I want to be mindful of my time and everybody else's time and stuff. And I do have a tendency to ramble. So I will try to be aware of that and not ramble too much. And then I do want it to be kind of a open for discussion, because the thing that stuck with me was military and law enforcement, are these institutions irredeemable? It was the kind of the term I heard. And I thought that's a really interesting term. And so I have a lot of opinions. I don't have solutions, but I have a lot of opinions. So welcome everyone. My name is Daniel Rhodes. Just to give you context who I am, I'm the undergraduate director of the social work program at UNC Greensboro. And this is a journey of going from the military and studying law enforcement to doing social work and restorative justice work and what I would consider peace building and peacemaking in communities, and talk about that journey a little bit. I wanted to start with this concept of service because, okay, thanks, Ron. And I do have the chat thing up, so if anybody wants to send me a little question. So if I kind of like drift off a little bit, it's either the cat or I got a chat. So, and we got another person. So I want to start with this concept of service, because when I will introduce my people and people ask me who I am and background and stuff, when you have those kind of niceties, those conversations, and I talk about, well, I was in the military, often I'll get people go, well, thank you for your service. And I will, depending on how snarky I am, I will, and I make a lot of really bad jokes too, so bear with me. I will talk to them about being a social worker and how nobody ever thanks me for that service. So it's like my military career was short, very influential, and I started early, but it's nothing compared to 30 years of social work in the community. And so, which I consider very important service. And, we often look at the military as like the ultimate sacrifice and you put your life on the line. I was in the infantry and my life has been more at risk as a social worker than it was when I was in the military. I was not ever in combat zones or anything like that, and I've served with very vulnerable and sometimes unstable populations, severe and persistent mental illness, crisis emergency services where people are having psychotic breaks, and there's these psychosis is projected upon me, and I'm perceived something that they have in their head because of their mental illness, and I'm perceived as a threat. And so I will tell people, I appreciate that, but there's a lot of people who do service every day, and I think this gets to the heart of wondering about ideas that are irredeemable, that people do service every day that never get thanked. We will thank them now in periods of crisis somewhat, that they get attacked, but medical professionals, we thank them for their service. Nurses, doctors, custodial workers in hospitals during the pandemic and stuff like that. But military is the one consistent thing that's always been, thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. And I'm like, well, yeah, I appreciate that. But I have spent 30 years doing social work. And that to me that's been more meaningful and fulfilling to me than the military was. And so I try to reframe that a little bit. And I also want to think about this term of people who are conscientious objectors. We don't think about conscientious objectors right now because we don't have a draft, and there are people, I think we are unaware that people who serve as conscientious objectors, and this is the Quaker part of me that's speaking, they do service, they do alternative service. And during times of military, when people are conscripted and people make this testimony of peace, I can't serve because of my, belief systems, and conscientiously I can't serve in something that takes somebody's life, then they're still expected to do some service. And some of them, such as Max, did service in a place that was a kind of a combat zone. He was in Ramallah in the 70s and stuff. And so I think we forget, because these narratives get projected out there about what service is, and we will confine service to certain things like the military or something like that. So I wanted to kind of start off with that idea of service. So I joined the Army at 18. That's the picture I want to show you, because I want to, it's an interesting, I want to show it for a little bit because I went to Fort Benning. I look 12 in that picture. I went to Fort Benning, Georgia. I joined the infantry. This was in 1986. You go to this military processing station at Fort Benning. They give you your clothing, they dress you up, and then they take your picture before you even start training. So this is literally before I even went through training. And so I was 18 years old, very young. And I was pulled into the military. And I wrote about this in my dissertation a little bit. There's a media theorist named Douglas Kilner, and he wrote about this idea called the Rambo effect. In the 80s was this hyper patriotic, I think it's still around, but it was this kind of post-Vietnam Reagan era hyper patriotism. And so movies like Red Dawn, Rambo, Commando, Top Gun, all these movies came out. And Douglas Kilner wrote about this several years later, and he called it the Rambo effect. So Navy recruiters, when Top Gun came out, they would put up recruiting stations in the military, in the movie theaters. And the same Army recruiters would put up Rambo posters and stuff like that. I was, as you could see in the picture, this weird, skinny little, teenager in a small rural community where this was the projection of masculinity and service. If you wanted to do something greater than yourself, you go in the military. And it was also my way of getting out of that small little town. I had to, and I think that my view of the military and law enforcement are different. So I think that's why I'm trying to split this off a little bit and talk about the military a little bit differently than law enforcement. So I went in the military and I went in the infantry, and I altogether was 5 years, active duty and reserves. And I eventually became a drill instructor, and I'm trying to find that picture.
Wow.
Can you see it? Let me,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
my screen is showing something different. Let me close one image so I can see it again. And so let me do the screen share again. So yeah, this was as in the reserves, towards the end of my service, had become a drill instructor. And that was part of that existential crisis of determining that the military was probably not the career path. At that time of this picture, I was in the reserves, finishing my associate's degree in criminal justice, and I was either just started or just finished law enforcement training. I don't think I'd started yet, rookie school. So I was going through rookie school, which is the 16-week law enforcement training thing to become a police officer. And the first Gulf War happened, and I was in, so it's just to the military structures divided into, squads, platoons, battalions. Battalions are the bigger part, companies and stuff like that. And I was in 3rd Battalion. There's 4 battalions. I was in 3rd Battalion, and part of us got activated. I was activated after the ground war. So this gets really complicated. So you've heard the term the backdoor draft. What happens when you go in the military, you serve for 8 years. So if I go in the Army for 2 years active duty, it's 6 years inactive reserves after that. I don't know how it may be the same now. That was 30 years ago. So you served for 8 years. You were committed to the military for 8 years. So if it's 4 years active, 2 years active reserves, it's 2 more years in active reserve. So I was in the active reserves as a drill instructor. This was not too long after Donald Rumsfeld went to the Pentagon and stated it was a bloated bureaucratic system, and they started to follow this corporate model in the military. So in the military, cooks, barbers, everybody was active duty military. And so they started to transition this before the first Gulf War, to outsource services in the military. So that means that we're going to contract cooks, people to come in to cook, and we're going to contract all these other. So they were releasing people from the military. They're basically putting them out. They were saving money. We're going to put people out of the military, and we're going to follow this kind of corporatist model of, downsizing and outsourcing. And then the Gulf War happened, and then they reactivated people. And that's what the backdoor draft means, is that I may have served 2 years in the Army. I'm done. I'm going to go home. I'm going to go to school, have a family, whatever. The military can call you back up anytime in that 8-year period or that 6-year period after. And as you've committed, you signed that dotted line. And so our roles as drill instructors was that we were going to train the inactive reservists who came back in because they were unsure what was going to happen with the ground war. We were going to train the inactive reservists that came back in quickly to get them reoriented to military life, and then ship them overseas to fight in a war that they were unsure of. And I really had a problem with that. That was the first time I think that I had shifted from going into the military when I initially went in, like, I'm going to be in the infantry and this and that and the other, to, okay, I'm not really sure about this. And now my responsibility is going to be possibly training people to go fight. And so it was kind of this existential crisis. And then the ground war lasted 96 hours. And so I was activated after that because of how reserves operates. And so it was activated for a 3-month period and shipped down to Fort McClellan, where I was a trainer as a drill instructor. And I had just finished rookie school, and it was like, I can't do any of this. This is not who I am. And so it was when I really kind of realized that kind of social engineering and I didn't know the language of it. We've got language for it now, like toxic or hegemonic masculinity or stuff like that. Years later, I get my PhD in a graduate certificate in women's gender studies. I've got all this wonderful language to describe this existential crisis that I was going through at the time. But at the time, it was like, what the hell? I don't know what I'm doing. This was my trajectory. I was either going to go back in the military and maybe serve in the military full time as an officer, or I was either going to be law enforcement, going to federal agency or something like that. And it really kind of hit me that I'm living this completely unauthentic life. This is not who I am. This was engineered of what Douglas Kilner later, as I stumbled onto it, called the Rambo effect, where I was fed, this certain mentality from the media, which became this kind of operating wing of the propaganda wing of the government, that this is what you have to do to be of service to your country or to other people or to the community and stuff. And it just completely fell apart. And so I often tell students that they need to embrace these existential crises, which you don't want to embrace it when you're in the midst of it. But it really forced me to in a position of being very reflective on who I was as a person, and to go back. And I joke about this inner child thing, which I think becomes somewhat of a, joke or caricature or whatever, but to kind of reintroduce myself to the person that I was before this social engineering really started to take hold. And I kind of had in my head, this is what I have to do. This is what I have to do. This is what I have to do. Which was to kind of look at what does it mean to be of service to others? And then what does it mean to have authenticity in your life and to be authentic to yourself? And what does it mean to be, engaging in community-based work that's different from what has been kind of handed to me over the years? And so, it's fascinating to look at those pictures now and to reflect on what I was feeling then. And I have 4 images, so I won't try to bore you too much with images. I have one more I want to share to really kind of reinforce this idea of social engineering. So my parents were photographers, and I grew up with photographers, and I do photography all the time. And I was on the annual staff, the yearbook. And so our yearbook photo, we dressed up in camouflage and went to the National Guard Armory and sat in the back of a military truck holding weapons, because Rambo and Commando and Top Gun were the movies that we were soaked and steeped in at the time. So I think this picture is actually in my dissertation. My first part of my dissertation, I talk about this journey a little bit, and how, and extra credit for anybody who can guess which one of me is in that photo. But it's
which one are you?
So right here, I think if we can circle it, holding the rifle.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my God.
Which one?
This one.
The one right here, I've got the camo makeup on my face and the beret and holding the image. And the pin on my hat is a Special Forces pin.
Mhm.
And the patch on the shoulder, I sewed this patch on that jacket as a Special Forces patch. My idea was I was going to go into Special Forces. While I was in high school, I was thinking about that and stuff. And that's the mentality. So when we think about these ideas of being irredeemable, and I don't have animosity towards the military, because I think we have a tendency to conflate what the military is in combat units, and many people serve in the military and it's like an 8 to 5 job. There's a difference to me between the military industrial complex, which is a system that is controlled by politicians and corporations to advance political ideas and agendas, and exploiting resources and stuff like that, and a person who's serving in the military, who's a social worker or a doctor. And there was I was thinking about debating if I was going to share it. There was the U.S. Army shared it. There was a TikTok of this woman. I was in the 108th Training Division, the Reserve Drill Sergeant Unit. They're the ones that shared it. So there's a Black female drill instructor who had also won some beauty pageant and is also getting like her nursing degree or something like that. And she's talking about in this TikTok video how the military had given her all these opportunities and stuff. And, so I think we have a tendency to conflate everything into this military industrial complex, which is a lot more complex. And so people will come to me often who have friends and family members who are thinking about the military. It's like, I want them to talk to you. And I think they labor on the assumption that I will try to talk them out of that. And I'm like, I can't do that. I will talk to them about my experience, my concerns about the military, my issues with violence and militarization. But, I can't talk them out of going in the military. I mean, it's a decision that person has to make. Law enforcement is different. So that's the second part that I'll get to when we talk about irredeemable. So I think my challenge because identify, so that journey of discovery for me was, this is not who I am. I'm not a person who needs to be in the military or be a police officer. I've got to do something different. And I transferred to UNC Greensboro, stumbled into social work and got into social work. And I was drawn to social work because of the values. So you'll hear me talk about values and ethics. Quakers, I mean, you look American Friends Service Committee, they have testimonies, and those are Quaker values. You look at the NASW Code of Ethics, we have social work values and ethics. And it's fascinating. Some of them are the same. Community is a Quaker testimony, and so is a social work value, this idea of service to others, dignity, worth of people. And so that's what attracted me to social work. And I don't think that I would have been able to come to that if I had not had that existential crisis. I mean, the being steeped in this, where it just is natural. We'll go to the National Guard Army, we'll dress up in camouflage, and we will pretend like we're soldiers as high school kids, talk about grooming. There's all this notion of grooming that you hear with politicians right now. For some reason, war and violence doesn't seem to be part of that language. But I needed that existential crisis. I don't think I would have come to social work. I mean, and that's why I like the background I have. I utilize that background I have in law enforcement and in the military often to argue about some of the issues that will come up in relation to it, because I've had that training, even though it's been years ago. So, it's part of, I think, what helped propel me towards the military. I graduated high school with a 1.86 grade point average. I was never meant to go to college. I don't think I would have had the confidence in myself to make it through school as this skinny little weird kid. I was not an athlete, but being able to make it through infantry basic training gives you an enormous amount of confidence, and then eventually become a drill instructor. It's like I struggled in basic training, as you saw that skinny little weird kid, and then eventually became a drill instructor. I don't think that I would have had the confidence to be able to go into a college, university setting. I don't think I would have had the confidence to do some of the work I did in social work if I had not had that experience, because I didn't get it in school. I didn't get that confidence there. And so that's why when people often say, I want you to talk to my family member about going to the military, I'm very cautious, and like, you may not get the outcome that you're expecting. I'm not going to encourage them to go in there, but I also can't talk them out of it. I can talk to them about what this experience is like. I can talk to them about the military industrial complex and stuff like that. But we have students who are social work students who want to go in the military and go in the medical corps and be military social workers. And, I will counsel them in what they need to do. And I think that I'm armed, for lack of a better word. I often frustrated with our language that we adopt, like social justice warrior, and Gandhi used the term for satyagraha as militant nonviolence, and he was a soldier and stuff like that. But students will come to me getting ready to finish their bachelor's degree, and they know they want to go in the military, and a recruiter is telling them something. And I think I can counter that narrative to some degree. And like, if you get your master's first, you've got a lot more negotiating power and in relation to rank and what you're able to do in the military, as opposed to if you go in with just your bachelor's degree, or if you don't have an education, like if you go in with a high school education, not lack of education. And so I would not be able to do that if I didn't have the military experience that I had. And to me, to me, dismantling law enforcement is a different concept than dismantling the military. My hope is that, how do if a social worker from our program decides to go in the military, how can I encourage them to get their master's degree and go in the military and try to help change a system that historically is part of the military industrial complex? That's, like I said, I have no answer to that, but I would prefer that a student has sat in my class and have read works on restorative justice and peacemaking. I have to endure my peacemaking circles, and some students that I had to in here talk about peace building as I go to the Summer Peace Building Institute, Eastern Mennonite, and come back with courses on truth and reconciliation process. I would prefer a student go into that system armed with those ideas, as opposed to a student who just finishes their degree and goes in the military and just says, I'm not going to question how these structures are set up. So law enforcement is different. So it's two different things. So I want to just take a break, because I know I've talked for a long time. Does anybody have any questions or challenges of that before I start talking about law enforcement, what got me into that, and how I see that as somewhat of an irredeemable system.
Do you think there would be a need for doctors and nurses and social workers in the military if we didn't see ourselves as using war as the first approach to, I mean, it's sort of a, I'm not sure what the words I'm looking for, but it seems like a backwards thing to say, go in and take care of people instead of let's not put them in that kind of stressful situation in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I want to address that. Are there other questions? Everybody wants to hear me address that one. That's a great one.
Sorry.
No, I think, no, because I think it's something I struggle with. And I think part of why this conversation came up is because in our business meeting, so for those who are unaware, I identify as Buddhist, Quaker, social worker. I have an odd, I always love the the two truths and a lie, because I will tell them, like, I was in the military, I was a Buddhist monk, and I can't, sometimes I'll come up with some bizarre thing and people go, the Buddhist monk is a lie. The military is a lie. And then I'm like, no, I was, the other one was a lie. So I lived in a monastery for 6 months studying Buddhism. I've studied Buddhism for 20 years. And Buddhism has the concept of ahimsa, which is nonviolence. And nonviolence, I think, is really important in that, from like Bayard Rustin, nonviolence is an ideology. So Bayard Rustin is the person who basically trained Martin Luther King Jr. in the ideas of nonviolence. Stokely Carmichael, who was part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, in the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, nonviolence to him was a tactic. It was not an ideology. And so it's interesting. I think when we talk about nonviolence, there's a continuum, and how do we place ourselves on that continuum, where Bayard Rustin, it was an ideology that he lived his life by. And for Stokely Carmichael, it was a tactic to be used in certain situations, but not in all situations. I think that's the problem I have, is not the military, but the society we live in. And that I don't think, I don't believe that the military is irredeemable, in that what gives a person purpose and choice, but I have to go in the military, and it gets reinforced. And so I agree with you. Yes. Why would we want to populate the military with nurses, physicians, and social workers when really their primary role is to fix people up and send them back into combat? I mean, that's really kind of their primary role. They may not see that on a day-to-day basis, because our views of active combat shift dramatically. And I think that that's a lot of that happens to be because of how the government works with the military, and how special operations may go do something we never hear about. And then we may have combat where we're in places like Iraq or Afghanistan for 20 years. And I think we can't really address that until we address what are the fundamental issues of our society. And the fundamental issues of our society is we glorify violence. We glorify, it's a dehumanizing, inhumane system where, and this is why I challenge people when they say, thank you for your service. Yes, thank you for saying that. But my service as a social worker has been dealing with trauma in communities and harm and healing and how to be a peacemaker. That's an important service. And so how do we construct our society in a way where we value peace in the same way that we value service, as in, military service? And I think that's, to me, that's what Quakers have to offer the world. And I think how we have to, in some ways, identify as a Buddhist and a Quaker, continuously try to reinforce that. And I don't know how that would happen. that's a structure. I mean, how do you create a society where, it's like I'm as excited about going into a community and teaching children as it would be jumping out of an airplane, and stuff. And also understanding that, people are ingrained in some of these ideas in a lot of different ways. I would take students to the Vietnamese Buddhist temple because students have the image in their head of Thich Nhat Hanh as this great peacemaker. And most of the Vietnamese Buddhists I've worked with are refugees and were supportive of the military action in Vietnam because they had to escape. They were persecuted after the United States left. And so it's an interesting dynamic for students to sit with this monk with the only image they have is Thich Nhat Hanh. And they're sitting with this monk who has taken vows of nonviolence because he's a monk, and then sit there and say, we came to this country to escape religious persecution. His father was a boat person, had to live in a refugee camp, and the monk will say, I probably would have served in the military too, fighting against the, North Vietnamese and the communists if I had, was old enough to do it. And so it creates a huge cognitive dissonance in students. And I love that, of course. But I think it also speaks that it's so much more nuanced and complex. And that's why it really requires an enormous amount of thought. And I think that that's going back as I ramble on. What I think brought this up was when we're sitting in a business meeting, we talked about nonviolence. And that's when I shared, this is something I really struggle with. Ideology versus tactic. I'm trying to embrace a nonviolence ideology, understanding that, for some people, it's just so beyond their concept of a reality. And how do we try to create a world where that's a reality for them? And so instead of, hey, I want to equip social workers going to the military to take in these ideas of restorative justice and stuff like that, how do we get to the point where we say, we don't need militaries? And I don't know, that's beyond my ability to comprehend. I don't have an answer for that. I wish I did. The only thing I can hope for is that my responsibility as a social worker is to continue to be a peace builder and peacemaker. And as I work with social work students, to try to ingrain that language with them, that your role as a social worker is to be a restorative justice practitioner, because we're working with traumas. There is we have two justice systems. There's a retributive justice system. This goes into the law enforcement piece, which I feel is so much more irredeemable. We have a retributive justice system that's based on crimes, laws, police officers, judicial system, judges, courts, and it's a traumatic system that needs to be changed, however you want to define that change. We don't deal with that system. We deal with trauma and harm in community, and our responsibility as social workers to be restorative justice practitioners. And that means that we also have to be peace builders and peacemakers in communities. And so I'm always saying, when I do a circle process, this is a peacemaking circle, this is a peacemaking circle, this is a peacemaking circle. And there's a reason that I kind of keep reinforcing that with students. Most of our students want to be peacemakers anyway. There is a handful, not a large number want to go in the military, but most of them want to, I think, go into communities. They come into social work because of the values and ethics and stuff. And so, but that's part of where I struggle. Yeah, I struggle with it. The military is a tough one. I'm saying this also as a person who's trained to be a police officer. And we've just come off a week where a Congolese refugee was executed, shot in the head by a police officer. And within the past couple of days, police officer arrested, I think, a 10-year-old kid for stealing a bag of Doritos and threw him in the back of a police car. That to me is an irredeemable system. And so I'm a lot more critical of that system. And I understand that people go, how did you go from wanting to be a police officer to being a social worker? It's like, it worked in my head, it says it on the car. to protect and serve. That's the kind of language that we use. But I think that people will go into law enforcement for more nefarious reasons than they sometimes will go in the military. I think they do go in the military with this notion of, not all of them are warmongers. I think they go in the military like, I'm going to defend these fundamental principles of democracy and freedom and this, that, and the other, and blah, blah, blah. And I think the government can exploit that desire, where I think that some people go into law enforcement because I want to serve the community and to be a service to the community. But I think some people, its system is rooted more, I think, in white supremacy. And I'm not a historian as far as law enforcement goes, but I think its system is rooted. And I have friends who have been police officers, and I was going to be a police officer, and I'm very critical of that system. And so that is a system I deal with a little bit more. Thank you, Robin. I appreciate you coming. And that what I would define as more irredeemable. I don't know what the law enforcement training is now. I went through it 30 years ago. It was 16 weeks. I talk about this in class. I wrote it and I was in graduate school, and I wish I had 2 binders. So 16 weeks, it's based on blocks of training. And I had 2 binders that we had to go through, and you have to take a test, a state test. You have to qualify with a weapon. There's all these things you have to do to be a police officer. And I did community mental health work, and afterwards when I got my MSW, and my training in law enforcement for mental health was a 4-hour training out of 16 weeks. And the first sentence in our training manual was that psychiatrists and mental health professionals do not understand what police officers deal with on the streets when dealing with mental health issues. And I wrote about that when I was in graduate school, in that you think about, the only amount of training you have for mental health training, because most police departments, you only have to have a high school education. Some of them require a bachelor's degree if they're credentialed program, certified law enforcement official, but most of them just high school education. And this training, and be 21. You think about that as a person who has no mental health training whatsoever. The first sentence is that already the mental health professionals in the community don't understand what you're dealing with. And so the resources that you would have access to as a police officer has already been dismissed in the very beginning. Now here's 4 hours of mental health training. Now go out in the community and do mental health work. And so that's why I'm a lot more critical of law enforcement and our kind of law enforcement system, which some would argue is a constitutional violation because of the militarization of law enforcement. There's a book called Warrior Cop, I think is the name of it. And it's about the militarization of law enforcement, which happened a lot after September 11th, where just flooded with money, small rural departments buying armored personnel carriers, and so one of the last images that I want to show, and I show this one in class quite a bit when I talk about doing community dialogue, it's not the one I'm saying. Hold on a second. The way I see it and the way you see things are different, I guess. Let me close out that image, and then let me pull up this and then do a screen share. And this is in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It's in 2016, one of the Black Lives Matters protest. Here's this young woman, I forget her name, she was a nurse. And so I use this in class, as some of the students will remember. And you look at the law enforcement and how they're dressed, and you look at how she's dressed. And I talk about this in relation to community dialogue, like how do we get law enforcement, police officers engaged in community dialogue about police responsibility and police accountability and stuff. And then I talk about the dehumanization aspect of this, like how they see this woman. You see this line of police officers that are clearly militarized. And when they say it's a constitutional violation of the Constitution, is because there's not supposed to be any standing military occupying the United States. So that's to prevent the military from taking over and occupying the United States. And some people are arguing, what we've done with law enforcement is we've militarized them. So now we have a standing military occupation because this is law enforcement. And so I talk about the dehumanizing aspect of how this woman is viewed by law enforcement. And then I talk about, I want to be a police officer to help the community. I get up in the morning and this is what I put on to go to work. How do I view the community if this is what I wear to go to work? I don't view the community as something to protect, to serve. I view the community as the enemy that I have to control. And that's dehumanizing for me, that this is what I have to do. But we've kind of stated that this is the norm. And, with law enforcement now, and we kind of did it. I don't think we actively did it, but after September 11th, we're like, oh, we're so worried. And so we kind of allowed this to kind of happen, and it snowballed. And so now this is what we have, but it happened before that. SWAT, special weapons and tactics, was in the 1970s. It was a response to the Black Panthers and other kind of, movements like that. So it's been around, but September 11th really propelled that forward. And so that's the system that I feel is somewhat more irredeemable. And I think that we have to take a more active role in stating, and I know that even this idea of being a abolitionist, abolish the police department, comes on a continuum to some degree also. But it's definitely not set up to do community building in any stretch of the means. So yes, John. I don't recognize your name, but no, I'm just kidding.
John Schoonover. She put it up there, didn't she? Yes. Well, how nice of her. There's something I think very important to keep in mind when you're talking about the police. Up until about the mid-19th century, businessmen and property owners rented thugs to protect them from the working class, minorities, and immigrants.
Yeah.
But about the middle of the century, the wealthy began to think, we could get the taxpayers to pay for this service. And that's when police departments came into existence, to protect the wealthy from, labor, immigrants, and minorities, troublemakers.
Yeah.
And so it's a totally reasonable evolution to find the police dressed up as RoboCops.
Another 80s
facing
movie.
off against, they are the enemy of the population at large. And vice versa. But that's their raison d'etre.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting, because I said I'm not a historian, but I read history quite a bit. And you read the history of slavery and the civil rights movement, people were deputized to go track down escaped slaves.
Yeah, that was what it was in the South, the slave patrols. But in the cities, wherever there was labor trying to organize, it was not about slaves.
Yeah.
It was about everybody else.
Yeah, and that's also interesting, because I'm reading a biography of Eugene Debs right now, and I'm fascinated with. I studied the anarchists and the labor movement, the 1900s, industrial workers of the world and stuff. Yeah, Pinkerton was the hired ones, but they were always.
That's right.
Mobilized law enforcement specifically to crush labor movements.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so you're right. That's why I say, I've tried to be very cautious, because I understand that sometimes people go into law enforcement because they think I want to protect and serve the community, but there's a lot of it rooted in white supremacy, in the crushing of labor movements and protecting the wealthy. And so you don't have to go too far into history to read this, and it all starts to evolve about, this is how these kind of systems manifested themselves. And you see it with unionizations now. I was just reading an article recently where the government was helping Amazon crush the unions.
Of course. That's what the government's there for.
Yeah.
But I think white supremacy is a bit narrow focus, because it's really capitalist supremacy. And you don't have to be white to be capitalist.
So this is where my attorney, no, I'm
So you have to be male.
I agree with you. No, I exactly agree with you. Yeah, I mean, that's the title of my dissertation is an anarchist psychotherapy. So there's no, you can type my name, PhD, and it pops up. So there's no kind of like, oh, he's trying to hide his radical leftist. I'm a card carrying member of the Industrial Workers of the World, which probably doesn't have much, weight in the country as they did 100 years ago when they were crushed. But yes, that is the history of it. It is a kind of neoliberal capitalist corporatist idea. In the South, it was very much rooted in white supremacy in relation to, people were deputized to track down slaves and bring them back, but in other parts of the country, it was used to protect the capital, the interest of the capitalist, interest of the people who own the means of production.
Well,
and stuff.
The plantation owners were capitalists too.
Yeah. So now we're devolving into this capitalist, but no, that's
I'm sorry.
No, I agree with you. And it's funny. I joke with students because I talk about, the conservative narrative out there is the, critical race theorist, Marxist professor who's trying to indoctrinate students. And I'm like, I'm that, I'm the Marxist critical race theorist that's trying to indoctrinate you. Fortunately, it's social work and all these values. And I think some students don't quite see it, but all these values really, I don't want to say they're anti-capitalist, but when you start talking about, you have a ethical value of social justice, which means you're to challenge social injustices, and you start to weed through the lengthy component of what that ethical value means. It is the socioeconomic, political, and economic violence is it. Capitalism is economic violence. There's no other way to put it. And people have to digest that. And I think people have a hard time digesting that part. I think my generations that are older than me, I went in the military during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was still our enemy, and so my first introduction to Marxism was going in the military, and communism was our enemy. And then when I got out of the military, I started to read Marxism. I was like, well, wow, this makes sense. And so, it's really fascinating to hear this kind of narrative of that, radical leftist Marxist professor, which was the person, the caricature of the 1960s, 1970s professor, being used today with very less understanding. I think it was back then. I think people at least had a little bit more understanding of what that meant back then. Nobody knows what it means today, except for a handful of people who were like Bernie Sanders or something like that, and decided to read some of the books. But you're right. There's no other way to put it, but it is rooted in this kind of corporate capitalism as I tell people, capitalism is to capitalize off of the labor of others. It's the exploitation of people's labor. Mm-hmm. And that's a system that's there to protect it. Yep. And stuff. So I think some people go in the military, when I was jotting notes down, when I entered the military, I asked if I'd ever been a member of the Communist Party. They didn't ask me if I'd ever been a member of a Nazi party or a Klan or anything like that. Yeah. But they asked me if I was a member of the Communist Party and stuff. And that's, I think, really speaks to how ingrained that idea is in our kind of narrative and stuff. So, all right. So I'm just going to delete this video. No, I'm just kidding. Thank you, John, for that. Other thoughts or questions? I can keep rambling on about that. I didn't get into great detail about my law enforcement experience was not direct. I think Ann left and she's back. It was not direct. I was not a police officer, and I'm glad that I was not a police officer. I think there would have been a lot of damage that would have been hard to me recover from if I had actually had to have been a police officer. I think that the military I was able to reflect on that process, and fortunately was not in a combat situation. I do not envy combat veterans. And it's fascinating. Every person I've talked to who's been in combat has an enormous amount of trauma and wish they had not been in combat. People who go in the military, who go in the infantry, I think glorify combat and wish that they had had some combat experience, because then they can say, oh, I've been in combat. But, people I've talked to have been in combat. It's not something that active combat where they've seen or have had to kill or been killed, or not been killed, but seen people been killed, I think is so traumatizing that they really suffer from that. And I think that that's
flying around.
But other questions or thoughts on my ramblings? We've already classified me as a Marxist.
Looking at sort of the question of reforming the military, I've heard sort of two, and I'm sure there are more, schools of thought of what the military might be changed into. Either changing the idea of the Department of Defense towards defending against something that's a actual threat, like climate change, of like having people do more National Guard or first responder stuff like that. Or the other one that I hear commonly is sort of changing it, rather than defense-based, being more like the Peace Corps sort of thing. Which do you think is more likely to happen, or would be more effective?
Yeah, I think it would. No, that's a good question. I think it would be more effective as kind of a humanitarian type, where, because that's what kind of the National Guard happens, if a situation comes up with a hurricane, they can get mobilized, and enormous amount of resources. I mean, they have an enormous amount of resources. I think that it has to be a paradigm shift. I think some people go in the military thinking it's humanitarian work to some degree, like I'm going to go and, and you'll see, I have not seen commercials in a while, but you will sometimes see commercials where they will kind of craft themselves as this humanitarian kind of idea. I don't know about the Peace Corps component of it. I think that that's more of a stretch, but I think that, you could, if you're wanting to change a system to be more humane, and humanitarianism has its issue for the students who've had my class, they've heard me talk about it from a Paulo Freire perspective of humanism versus humanitarianism. But, humanitarianism, I think, has an element to it that people would be willing to go into it. I think, like I could perceive myself as I reflect back as an 18-year-old kid of, I would go in the military and go through this, rugged training and jump out of a plane and land somewhere and give people food, that would be great. So I think that, if we're going to change that system, but I'm still pessimistic because we still have a system of the media that is constantly going to reinforce, this kind of glorification of military, of combat and fighting and being the warrior and stuff like that. And I think that that's going to require a huge paradigm shift in our thinking in general. John, you had something?
I don't think it's a terribly bad analogy to think of the U.S. military in particular, not the militaries in general, but the U.S. military in particular, as the U.S. government, empire, police force to keep the rest of the world in line, very much along the line of what police forces are, but on a global scale, and the enemy being other countries,
and
rather than labor movements and things like that.
And I think that that's the pessimism I have, because I think the average person going in the military won't think in those terms.
No, unlikely.
Yeah. And so I think that that's why I have pessimism with it, because I think that a person will go into law enforcement because there's enough research out there that shows, X number of police officers have, this, connection with white supremacy or whatever, where they're thinking I'm going to go, police a particular group of people per se or something like that. But I think the average person going to the military, even me going to the military, I didn't think in terms like we're going to go police the rest of the world. And I think that that's kind of the insidiousness of how mainstream media, as we joke about the left liberal, Hollywood elite, but this is the same thing that produced Rambo and Commando and the new Top Gun that just came out, I guess, recently or coming out or whatever, that continuously reinforces this image of, I'm going to go in the military to defend democracy and freedom. And those powers to be are the ones who are manipulating people to reinforce this sense of, Judy, I'm sorry.
I also wondered when Bernie Sanders was pushing strongly the idea of making at least state universities, public universities tuition free, what that would do to the military. Because I also think a major reason for people going into the military is they'll pay for school.
Yeah.
And if you all of a sudden take that away and say, you don't have to worry about paying for school, just go, how that would affect the recruitment process.
And two things that it's and this and that, in that, yes, because I will still say that narrative of like, well, there should be mandatory conscription, that all people should serve in the military. That's our only that's why I started with this idea of service. That's the only definition of service. Like, okay, if I decide I want to go into a community and help build a community center or do something to serve the community, I should have the same resources as a person who's going to the military. And the problem with the military is that money doesn't always come through the way people think it's going to. That's what I recognize with my GI Bill. And that's what I recognize with students I work with. It paid for my associate's degree up to a point. If you change your major a couple of times, it'll quit paying. There were 2 or 3 times this was back before the internet and stuff like that. I would get a letter, your GI benefits are cut. I'd have to drive to Winston, schedule an appointment, meet with them, figure out what happened. It was some paper glitch. And, as I look back on it now, these paper glitches are designed, they're engineered. Like, finally, when I transferred to university, like, I'm not going to deal with it anymore. It's just so frustrating. It's not that much, And so what a lot of veterans are finding is that doesn't always pan out the way they thought it was going to, So I'll go in the military with this expectation you're going to pay for college, and then you don't wind up paying for college. I still wind up having an enormous amount of debt. But yes, free tuition, education should be free. It's a human right. And why can't we define service beyond the ultimate sacrifice? Like, why do I have to go into the military when, to me, service, and this is why I talked about conscious actors, in that, like I said, Max went to Ramallah for 2 years. Why can't I, as a person who have moral objections of serving in the military, not be able to do service within communities and have that access, even though it doesn't come through, but have the same resources and access that the person in the military does? That to me is what's frustrating. And that's why when people say, thank you for your service, I appreciate it, but here's 30 years worth, nobody's thanking me for that, and my life was more in jeopardy when I was a social worker than it ever was when I was in the military and stuff. So, I agree with you. It's a challenging, but I don't know. I have no answers. But I would love some more questions. I could blather on and just,
I guess what strikes me is no one thinks of the military in this country as actually defense. It's clearly an arm of aggression.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean, it just strikes me in this conversation. I mean, and that's a problem with making it humanitarian, because we're always saying oh, we're doing, thank God we're saving the women in Afghanistan from a terrible culture, and on and on. We're always faking some reason.
Yeah.
Um,
I think among us, we see it as a system of aggression. I think that the average person sees it as a system of defense. And it still is astounding to me. That was the existential crisis. Like, it was clearly an act of aggression. We didn't care about Kuwait. I'd never heard of Kuwait before. This happened right after Tiananmen Square. These are people in China who were trying to stand up to an oppressive regime for democracy. And we were like, don't do that. And then this tiny little country, Kuwait, gets invaded. And we're like, we've got to take over. And that was the first time I was like, this is not about defense. This is clearly about aggression and resources, and that's, in my mind up to that point, it was about defense. It was like, yes, I'm here to defend freedom and democracy and all these other wonderful things that, make me feel warm and fuzzy about myself. Look at these people in China, this one person setting up these, tanks because of freedom. That's what we represent. But we're not going to invade China by any means. We're just going to say, don't do that. And rightly so, we don't have the right to invade China. It's a nuclear power. Just, but we can invade Iraq and defend Kuwait, which I had never heard up to that point. And I was like, this is really fascinating. And so that's when it, hit me that this is a system of aggression. But I think the average person doesn't think of it as a system of aggression. And I think that's as Quakers, part of our, I think, responsibility in trying to name and claim peace and nonviolence and what that looks like, and understanding, what these systems are and how do we create a society that gives people alternatives than going in the military. I would have loved to have grown up. Gandhi came out when I was 12, and I was just so astounded by that movie. And I grew up in a community that glorified violence, small rural Southern community. And I had no resources whatsoever. This is what I had, it's like, it's a survival mechanism. I'm this weird little kid who likes Gandhi and Star Wars. I'm going to have to go in the military.
Well,
What are you going to do?
Having worked a little bit as a volunteer in the first grade in the public school, the military is presented as defending our freedom.
Yeah.
I mean, it starts very young.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And it was my way of getting out of that community. And that's, I think, part of, I needed to be in a space with a diverse group of people. And this is a narrative I'll talk about also with the military, what's really complex. When you look at the military in relation to corporations, as a corporation, it has done better. The Army, not the others, Air Force, maybe the Marines, not so much so. The Army has done more than any other corporation to promote women and minorities in the position of leaderships than corporations have, and think about that. If I am a person of color, or if I'm a woman and I want to get in a position of leadership, and I'm looking at the corporate world and I'm thinking, no, and I'm looking at the military and I'm thinking, I have this opportunity to gain rank in positionality. That's another attraction. That's why that TikTok video with that female drill instructor was talking about, I'm going to college, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And so, that's part of also the complexity of the military and how it, pulls people into it, is this notion of, I can be promoted, I can get positions of leadership in the military that I couldn't have. And it was another thing, they were interviewing, this is right after, I think, the second Gulf War, when a lot of veterans were coming out of the military, and they were doing this training to try to get them prepared for the corporate world. And they couldn't function in the corporate world because in the military, you have to function as a team, as a community. You're living together, you're eating together, you're sleeping together, and it's all life and death. When you go in the corporate world, it's, I'm going to get what's for me, even from my coworker. I have to defeat them to get up this position. And people who are coming from the military were going through these trainings and trying to get into the corporate world, and they couldn't function in it because it was so antithetical. And I think that's what's really, I think part of that cognitive dissonance, and it's what's so fascinating, is like I go in the military and I'm part of the community. You know, like I felt more part of a community in the military than I ever did in the small little hick town that I grew up in, you know. And so I'm part of this community. Now you're trying to train me to go into a corporate world where it's like, I've got to get over my friend, you know, I've got to cut their throat so I can get what's for me. I don't care about them. That's the insidiousness of capitalism. And I think that most people are community oriented. And so the exploitation of community orientation is you're doing this for community, but it's really about policing the world in some degree. So. I will talk to my attorney after this.
You might want to emphasize the fact that, at least the way you describe it, that the military teaches socialist values.
It does. It absolutely does. Yeah. You are taught to function as a community, and the only way that you are successful
Is if the
there's no
community
like
is
you're the
successful.
weakest link. Like if one of my comrades in my unit is not able to perform, it's our responsibility to make sure they're able to function as a team. And you recognize people's strengths and weaknesses, and you help amplify their strengths, and you help them overcome their weaknesses. And yes, it is very much a socialist oriented. It's free medical care. It's not free. I had a friend
for it.
Yeah, it's true. I had a friend of mine, and I was tongue in cheek. I felt he'd been in the Air Force, and so he had married a friend of mine, this guy, and my friend's daughter was struggling, 18, 19. She flunked out of college. She's trying to find a job. She's really struggling. She's kind of cycling in and out of their house. And he's like, when I was 18, I was worked and this, that, and the other. And I was like, when you were 18, you were in the Air Force. Your food was paid for, your housing was paid for, your medical care was paid for, everything was paid for. You didn't have to think about anything. They told you where to go, where to sleep, where to eat. Everything was taken care of. When you are 18 years old and you're making at best minimum wage, probably less than that if you're doing service because you were supposed to be making tips, you don't have insurance, you don't have, food, you don't have housing and stuff. So yes, it's very much a socialist structure within that, in that, you're expected to function as a team, as a community, work together, highlight people's strengths. There's competition in it to some degree, but it's, playful competition, I think, somewhat. I can do more push-ups than you or whatever, but you function as a team, and that's really important. And that I figured out really quickly when I was in basic training. I was weak, I was skinny and weak, and I needed help, and people helped me be successful to make it through basic training. I would not have been able to do it if we were this cutthroat, every person for themselves, and it's part of why I became a drill instructor. I had more respect for my drill instructors than I ever did for a high school coach I did in school, because I was a weakling in school. And so I didn't serve a coach any purpose. I wasn't going to be on a football team or track team or anything like that. The drill instructors in the military taught me more about health and activity and exercise and taking care of myself than any high school coach or any coach in school ever did, any PE gym teacher or any of that stuff. And so I'm very critical of PE. Probably not now, they're probably different than they were then, but I was very critical of PE teachers. And part of why I became a drill instructor was because I want to make sure people are successful when they don't think they can be. That's a very socialist thinking, very socialist mindset. Yeah. Pinko leftist commie mindset. So I like Quakers. They're mostly made up of Pinko leftist commies. Not all of them though, of course, but so other questions. Oh man. Thank you all for those questions. I love reflecting on this now. I did a podcast last week, a restorative justice podcast, and a lot of these kind of similar questions came up. Like, how did you get into restorative justice work? And so I guess in my middle age, I'm doing this reflection, whether you want to or not, you know, of my life. So.
I'd like to hear a little more about your experience in police training and the racism that was apparent or not then.
I don't think I don't think I was conscious enough to understand I don't think the training itself was grounded in racist ideology. I think the laws and policies that happened afterwards do. They were, I mean, this was 30 years ago. There were Black people and white people and women who were in law enforcement training with me. So I don't think I was, and it would be, that's why I think it would be good to have those binders. I wish I had kept those binders to go back and look at them now. What a great document, you know, kind of an ethnographic, kind of auto ethnographic thing, if I were to be able to look at those again. You know, when I went in the Army, it's really fascinating. You know, I had Black drill instructors, Latino drill instructors. The narrative was, we don't see color, we see either light green or dark green. You know, that kind of, that color blind mentality in the military. And it was interesting, when I went in the Army, we had one of the recruits in my training used the N-word in reference to one of the drill instructors to a group of people, and we had a training on racism in basic training, and somebody reported that he had used that word, and they kicked the person out of the military. They cycled him out.
Wow.
And this was in 86. This was a fascinating thing to watch as an 18-year-old who came from a rural racist community, whose parents would define them as anti-racist today. They wouldn't define themselves then at that time. My aunt and uncle were my parents, but they were really trying to instill in me these values of, you know, you do not be racist and stuff like that, as conscious as I could be of it at 18 years old. I mean, you know, and growing up in a small town. And it was fascinating to watch that unfold, and coming from a community where there's blatant racism, and I'm like, I've got to get out of this community, and to see how an institution responded to it because a person made a racist comment, and they said, and you know, the military's got a bunch of racists in it. There's no doubt about that, you know, and that's been what they've struggled with over the years. But to watch that institution respond to it in a way like, we're not going to tolerate this, and what they call recycle. And so if you have an injury, you have to step back, and then you have to go back to you're not part of your unit that moves forward. You have to go to another training unit that's where you were injured. So they took him and they recycled him into another unit. And that was, I think, more of just kind of messing with him before they finally kicked him out, because they were looking for more than just that one particular reason to kick him out. And they put him out of the military. Astounding to watch that. I didn't see that level of understanding when I went through law enforcement training at Davidson County Community College, you know, in 1988. You know, but I don't think that there was that, when you're going through law enforcement training, I don't know how law enforcement training is now. You know, I don't know, but we don't have the same things that are brought up because of social media. We're seeing what police officers are doing. You didn't see it then. You know, you saw the Rodney King incident. You know, you heard about the, you know, Central Park 5, but that was, you know, that was it. That's all you saw. You now see a police officer holding down a Congolese refugee and gunning him down in the head. It's like, that's right there. And so I'm curious as how law enforcement training is responding to that training. So I heard something, but we didn't really talk about it. You know, I don't think there was enough insight. I think the point of the training was, you've got to learn these things to pass this test to get qualified and go into it. So I I don't remember hearing, because I remember being in community college, and I would hear people make racist comments, and I would confront, like, I'm not going to listen to that. Or, I would be really smug about it. People would say something, and I'm like, oh, that's curious. I don't think that way. Instead of like, I'm not going to handle your racism. And I would keep kind of challenging them or whatever. But I didn't hear that in rookie school. And I think people were maybe somewhat hypervigilant that, okay, we probably shouldn't say these things. So I'm sure they were racist in my rookie school class, but it was not spoken to some degree. So I would be curious to know how law enforcement is dealing with racism in departments. I don't think they're dealing with it very well, but I don't know if that really got to what you're asking, Anne. I'm sorry.
No, it wasn't the answer I was expecting, but it answered it. I wonder, since Rodney King in Greensboro, do you see any changes there in law enforcement? I mean, you have a particular perspective on it.
That's a good question. I mean, we have a chief of police who's black now. We have a sheriff who's black. I don't know. I don't think that necessarily changes the dynamics. My experience with Greensboro Police Department, Sheriff's Department has been different. The Greensboro Police Department historically, and so example, I have to give examples. So David Ficario used to be the director of Faith Action International House, and he created, the neighbors, the strangers to neighbors, and the photo ID program. And the photo ID program was that a person can go to Faith Action House, maybe undocumented. Anybody can do it. I could go get an ID from them. Person go to Faith Action House, undocumented, get a photo ID. The Greensboro Police Department will take that ID as a valid ID and not question a person's documentation status. And when I think it was 97G was coming into effect before secured communities, the sheriff before, I forget his name, who was the previous sheriff? He was the racist. Barnes. He was willing to work with ICE. The Greensboro Police Department said, we're not ICE agents. We're not going to do that. And so I had Ficario come and present one of my classes of community buildings at Guilford College. And a lot of students at Guilford College were working with Beloved Community Center. And so one of the students asked him, is like, well, do you work with the Beloved Community Center? And David gave a really great answer. He said, I have a lot of respect for what Beloved Community Center. For those who are unaware, the Beloved Community Center evolved out of the 1979 Klan massacre, when the neo-Nazis and Klan rolled up into Morningside homes and gunned down labor activists, Communist Worker Party. And so Nelson Johnson's his name, he created Beloved Community Center. Is based on Martin Luther King's idea of beloved communities. And so the Beloved Community Center has a very contentious relationship with the Greensboro Police Department dating back to 1979, and Nelson Johnson is part of that in the Truth and Reconciliation process. And so person was asking David Ficario, does Faith Action work with Beloved Community Center? He goes, I have a lot of respect for Beloved Community Center does. I have to think about the community I work with, who are primary immigrant and refugee populations and undocumented immigrants. And anytime the Beloved Community Center becomes involved, the Greensboro Police Department kind of shuts down. I think they still do. They just are very resistant to work with Beloved Community Center. So David said, I have a very good working relationship with the Green. He's a lot more diplomatic than me right now. I have a working relationship with the Greensboro Police Department. I have worked with immigrant and refugee populations who have had experiences with the Greensboro Police Department. I've even wrote an article about this, talking about immigrant refugees in the population. Thank you, Angela. I will see you tomorrow, right? And where I worked with an undocumented client who had a daughter, and one of the community members tried to molest her daughter, and she caught it, called the Greensboro Police Department. They came, arrested the guy, removed him, and never asked her documentation status. And so what David is trying to indicate is that because the Greensboro Police Department is willing to do that, our community is safer. Whereas the Sheriff's Department is unwilling to do that, it makes communities unsafe. And so I don't know. There's a lot of history with the Greensboro Police Department that's unresolved. The Truth and Reconciliation process being a part of that, police accountability. There's a program called Counter Stories that evolved out of that truth and reconciliation process. I was part of those counter stories about a year after it started, and Jeremy Rinker from Peace and Conflict Studies and we broke off into committees. One committee was on police accountability, one committee was on police community dialogue, and one committee was on restorative justice. And Jeremy and I kind of started the community on restorative justice. And we had a police officer who was really wanting to try to figure out how law enforcement can become more restorative. And we were trying to work with him, and then they promoted him, and that was it. That was the last connection we had with the police department. I try to think in terms of trauma among police officers and correction officers and stuff, and how do we deal with their vicarious trauma and stuff. But I don't work with police department. I have not actively reached out to police departments. I do restorative justice work. I would like to work with the police department. I think it's beyond my scope to some degree. Not that I wouldn't, as Jeremy and I are talking about reestablishing restorative justice circles in the community, peacemaking circles in the community. If a police officer comes, we would welcome the police officer. But I know we've sat in those circles with a person who was a child, a descendant of somebody who was a part of that 1979 shooting and was there. And the police officer who comes in uniform, and the person says, I can't sit in a circle while he's wearing his uniform because of the trauma. And so that's a very complex process that we have to navigate. I'm always going to fall on the side of, I want to protect this community, and this is where I'm going to do restorative justice practices. And I will be more than happy to work with law enforcement as they become a part of that, but it's not essential to me. Mm-hmm. I'm an abolitionist in that I don't necessarily believe in the law enforcement system we have established today is functioning and is useful. I think that police officers serve a purpose. If somebody breaks into my apartment, I'm going to contact a police officer. But I think that our system of law enforcement as it's set up today is a dysfunctional system that traumatizes communities and executes people, and is an arm of the US government. It was Judas and the Black Messiah. What was his name? Fred Hampton. I mean, US government assassinated Fred Hampton, And so I know a police officer. I don't know police officers personally. I know of police officers, and that one police officer, if I were to see him, I was like, oh, it's great to see you. And please, we'd love for you to come back to the community circle. But I'm not the type of restorative justice practitioner that's going to, be a part of that system, which can be challenging, because I think to be effective restorative justice practitioners, it's on a wide range. In communities, you have to be willing to work with the criminal justice system, and I have had work with students who work in communities that have to work. And I had to work with police officers when I did crisis emergency services work too, so I had to have relationships with police officers, and I understand the importance of that relationship. But it's complicated, and I would be cautious in having a bunch of police officers show up if I'm working with a community that's had a lot of trauma because of law enforcement. Mm-hmm. I would be working on that trauma piece before, and that's the point of truth and reconciliation. Forgiveness and reconciliation is that truth, trauma healing has to happen before you can have reconciliation, and reconciliation is down the road. We all want to jump to reconciliation because it makes us feel better. As a white male who occupies this country that was founded upon the enslavement of Africans and the subjugation of women and the execution of indigenous populations, I want reconciliation because it makes me feel better. But we need truth before we can even get to reconciliation. A really great documentary. And we should, I think, as the Quaker meeting, we should host it. There's a copy of it in the library. I ordered a copy of it. It's called Dawn Land, DAWNLAND. And it's about the truth and reconciliation process in Maine, and I show it to students because it was child welfare workers, social workers who went into homes of Native populations and removed the children from their homes and put them in foster care system. And so we, as Friendship Friends, we may want to think about hosting a viewing of that documentary, and then we can talk about the Truth and Reconciliation process. Because there's a wonderful part where one of the Native representatives in the Truth and Reconciliation process said, "You all want reconciliation. We should have just called this a truth process," because that's what it is. Reconciliations, we're nowhere near that right now, and stuff. And so I think that's kind of my view with law enforcement, and it's probably my personal view. And because I remember the conversation was like, well, Daniel, maybe you can go talk to some senators because you've been in the military. It's like, that's probably not going to be a good thing, because I don't think that would go over very well, because I have my own personal baggage with it that I still struggle with and stuff, if that makes sense. That was a long answer. I'm sorry, Ann.
That's fine. I wonder if there are other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. This has been, thanks
you.
everyone for joining us, and very, very interesting. I'm so glad we recorded it. And
I am too.
because I think